Hi everyone. This is going to be a quick video on Pojman's piece, Ethical Relativism versus Ethical Objectivism. And I made a couple of slides here. This piece is interesting. Sometimes the students say it's a little bit confusing or too many isms. I've had that response. And I think if you felt that, you're definitely right. I think what Pojman is trying to say in this piece is that a question that seems pretty simple, whether the morality is objective, that is, if there's a right and wrong, or whether it's subjective or relative, is actually a pretty complex question, and there's a lot of different possible positions, right? So he kind of illustrates that really well in this piece. And I'll try to walk you through it a little bit and maybe hopefully clarify a little bit of it and help you out to understand what he's saying. So I'll just go through the reading and just tell you what I think about it. Okay. So the first distinction that Pojman makes in the reading is between what he calls ethical objectivism and ethical relativism. Ethical objectivism would be the idea that there are universally valid moral principles, while ethical relativism would be the idea that there are no universally valid moral principles. So this is kind of a vague, like, what is a universally valid moral principle? What's what does relativism entail and so forth? And he tries to kind of break this down a little bit more, right, in the reading. Just as a heads up, in the ethics class, and in the slides further ahead, you'll see what most philosophers have tried to create in their ethical systems typically includes universally valid moral principles. All right, so just as a heads up, but they're not every philosopher, like Pojman refers to in this reading. There are some philosophers who are ethical relativists as well, but the ones we will study, the main names, a lot of them are going to be universal, are going to be objectivists. Okay. All right, let's see what's next. He then talks about ethical skepticism as being different from ethical relativism, just something that I think some people get surprised with. They're like, oh, I thought ethical skepticism was the same as ethical relativism. And he says, no. Ethical skepticism is it's not the idea that morality is relative to something else, say to a culture or to a person, but it's just the idea that we don't know what morality is. It could be objective, it could be relativist, it could be subjectivist, it could be anything. We just don't know, and there's no way of knowing. So that would be an ethical skepticism position, right? Now, the other position he talks about that's also outside of the sphere of these two is he calls ethical nihilism. So that's the idea that there's no such thing as right or wrong at all, not relative, not objective, not anything. And you're sure there isn't. So it's not skepticism. Skepticism would be like, I just don't know. And nihilism is like, there isn't. All right. So it's kind of a difficult argument to make that there isn't at all, that you're sure there is. All right, let's go back to the original division, because this is basically the most important thing he is talking about. And he's going to go through this, and he's going to try to show us other different small variations on these two big positions. And I do think it is important to understand that in philosophy and in ethics, it gets pretty complex, and people's positions are pretty specific. So I think even if you don't understand everything he's saying in here, it is interesting to see how he's dividing these things. So the first thing he talks about is ethical subjectivism as contrasting with ethical relativism, which I mean, in my other videos, I do talk about that. So the specifics of ethical subjectivism is that ethical subjectivists say that ethical principles depend on the subject, on the individual. So I can like one thing, I can believe one thing is good, you believe a different thing is good, and that's fine. one example from philosopher Julia Driver that she gives is that an ethical subjectivist would say that right and wrong would be similar to like personal preference. So say, for instance, you like sardines and I don't like sardines. That's fine. We don't need to argue about that. So your preference is sardines, my preference is I don't like them. We, that's fine. There's nothing to argue about. Now, an ethical subjectivist would say that ethics is similar. So say if I say abortion is permissible and you say no, it's not permissible, then that's it. We don't have anything to argue about. Now, Julia Driver is the philosopher I'm talking about. She's going to make an argument that those are not the same kind of questions. It's not that we have an answer to the abortion question, but it doesn't seem to be of the same nature of I like sardines. But ethical subjectivism in a simple way, when it's presented in a simple way, could be construed like that. All right, so then he talks about ethical conventionalism, which is actually something that I don't typically see referred to like that. I mean, contractualism maybe, or ethical relativism as right and wrong, depending on agreements that we've made with each other. The term ethical conventionalism, I don't really see that used in literature that much. But what it means basically, it's ethical relativism, and it just means that right and wrong would depend not on the subject, but on agreements or social agreements that people have with each other. So it's another way of saying ethical relativism, but it's more like underlines that it's based on conventions, right, between people. So that's another position he talks about. Then he talks about subjective universalism, which would be to claim that, yes, ethics is based on the individual, but the individual makes universal claims. So I would think about, okay, what is right and wrong? And I think abortion is permissible. And then when I'm saying abortion is permissible, I am claiming this for everyone because of the arguments that I have. And for subjective universalism, he talks about Jean-Paul Sartre and Hare. Something to think about. All right, so I'm not going to go into it, but Sartre would say that we create what's right and wrong, right? So he says his existentialism is a philosophy from the 60s in France that says that, their big catchphrase is existence precedes essence. That means we're not defined until we actually do something. And so by doing something, we would be defining what's right and wrong. All right, so that would be subjective universalism. And you guys don't need to know all these different things. I mean, the point of this reading is just to illustrate how complex these positions can be. And I think he does a good job with that. All right, on the objectivism side, he makes a really interesting distinction between moral absolutism and moral objectivism, which he distinguishes between those two. Moral absolutism would be like, say, for instance, a religion that has very strict rules like the Ten Commandments or something like that, that you can never break no matter what. And those commandments are compatible with each other. So it's not like you have to pick one or the other. You can follow them all. And Kantianism, he says, is in this attempt to do something like this. On the other hand, he has moral objectivism as something like, yes, someone can think there are principles, but still say, all right, sometimes I can have to pick between two principles and one might take precedence over the other. That's how he distinguishes them. I'm not sure I agree with all these distinctions, but I still think it is very important to look at this and see how complex philosophical positions can be and ethical positions can be. All right, so hopefully that will illustrate. And here we go with nihilism and skepticism on top. I just made it very complex, so you can see the big complex, all the things he's talking about. All right, why is it so complicated? And the students often either have an initial intuition that ethical relativism is right, or some other students have an intuition that objectivism is right. The motivation for those intuitions before you study ethics is very simple, right? So people have a motivation to believe in objectivism. They often had like a religious upbringing, or they have very strong moral principles, and so they think that there's definitely a right and wrong. So they're not going to give that up, right? And people who have a tendency to fall on the relativism, subjectivism side, or people who think that we should respect other people's beliefs, we shouldn't encroach on other people. And both those intuitions are good. You know, it's not like one is wrong and the other one is right. This is what motivates people to initially fall on one side or the other. All right, so what is going on here? Basically, this, in my opinion, what's going on here is that morality is a very vague term and is like an umbrella term that includes all these different things, right? So, I mean, people have moral intuitions about whether, I think, in an example that a student gave me from the Johnny Cash movie, someone was criticizing June Cash because of her having gotten a divorce. So some people have really moral intuitions about marriage, and then some other students also brought up marriage. Some people don't. So morality can be, like we saw in another reading, it can be related to sort of whether we should kill someone or torture someone or not, or it could be whether we should ever lie, or all these different things, right? So it's very vague, and it encompasses a lot of different moral intuition types. Now, it could very well be that some of the things we consider moral or immoral fall in the ethical objectivism side. So, for instance, torturing babies could be something that's always forbidden. And some of the other things that we consider moral or immoral, so one example that Pojman likes to give is lying, right? In the other reading we did, um, they could fall on the relativism side, or even cost, like marriages, or the way you're supposed to treat your family and things like that. They could fall on this side. So you don't really have to pick between one side and the other side. You can just say, okay, well, there's these things that are different culture to culture, different person to person, and those things are relative. But there are other things that I actually think should be universal. Like, for instance, there should be no slavery. Understand what I'm saying? So they could be both. You could have some things that you want to put on this pocket here, and there's some things you might want to put on this pocket here. All right. So that's definitely something that's not in the reading. I'm not saying this is in the reading. I'm just saying this is how I look at this. All right. What a lot of the philosophers we're going to study did is they did try to come up with universal principles that would pick what would fall into this side, into the objectively moral right and wrong side. That wouldn't be just based on cultures and subjective feelings and things like that. You guys can, as we go through the course and through the class, you can see whether they succeeded or not, but these are just some examples of principles that philosophers come up with. In Kantian ethics, he's got an example called the categorical imperative. It's kind of a test that you can apply when you want to know if something is right or wrong. And the quote is, act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Sounds really kind of difficult, but it really is not. What he's trying to say is, if you're about to do something, think about, can you will that everyone does the thing you're about to do rationally, right? So a lot of the things that are considered immoral are things that you cannot rationally will everyone to be doing. Example, I don't want to make this too long, so I'll just give one example. I won't give the lying example, which is what most people know or mention when we talk about content ethics. We'll talk about that when we get there. But say, for example, can you will that if you're about to rape someone, right? What is rape? Rape is like a sexual assault that is by definition not consented, right? So the person, the victim, did not consent to that. Can you rationally will that everyone does that? You can't, because you would have to will that you consent to something that you would not consent to in the definition of rape. So if you can will to be raped, then that's not rape because you consented. Does that make sense? So anyway, that's just one example. But a lot of the things that we typically consider immoral, Kant thought that if you thought about it this way, if you try to universalize it, you can see that there's something logically wrong with that. That's what he thought. All right. And again, if you don't get it, don't worry about it. We'll come back to Kant later. Utilitarianism is another theory we will study. And they had, the Bentham had the principle, it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. You may not believe that. You may think that, I think a student said something like, oh, I would save my wife before I save 1,000,000 people or 1,000 people. Or I think you said 1,000 people, not 1,000,000. And you may not believe this principle, but it's an attempt to an objectively, universally valid principle, all right? Even virtue ethics, Aristotle is objective in a sense. He does think that when you're faced in a certain specific circumstances, there is the right action to do, and there are other actions that are wrong. All right, so he's kind of objectivist in that sense. He just doesn't think you can universalize it for any other situation, but he does think that there's a right action. So he says something like, the right action is done at the right time, about the right things, towards the right people, for the right end, and in the right way. And it's typically it's the mean between two extremes. Now, again, we're going to come back to all these things. I just wanted to give you some examples of what universal principles look like and what objectivism can look like in ethics. And that's what we will study. Now, with relativism, I also think it is important to clarify some things because it is kind of confusing, and there's a lot of confusion around it. And I think in some of your responses, I could see that coming up. So I want to try. I'll try my best to be as clear as possible about this. So one thing that Pojman says is that there's a difference between cultural relativism and ethical relativism. So what is that difference? I know some of the students sometimes are like, I don't get what the difference is. So the difference is that cultural relativism is just a descriptive theory. So say if you're an anthropologist and you go around the world and you see what different cultures think is moral and immoral, and you take it all down, that's just saying how people behave, right? Ethical relativism takes a next step, which is to say, this is not just how people behave, but this is all there is to ethics. Now, Ruth Benedict, who's an author that's in here in the book, was one of the original anthropologists that started this idea of cultural relativism. She actually was also an ethical relativist, but you don't have to be. So here's the deal. You could go around your different cultures, see all the different customs and see all the different moralities people have, and you could still say, hey, look, this part of this culture is not good, and this part is good. You can evaluate cultures. Does that make sense? You can say, all right, so if I go to a culture where say some people are being mutilated, right, against their will, they don't want them being mutilated, I can say that is wrong. But that doesn't mean that everything in that culture I'm going to say is wrong. All right. Now, we tend, some students are like, who am I to say that this other culture is wrong? Which is good. It's a good, like, sort of intuition to have, because you don't want to be too, rushed in making that judgment, whether the other, because it might just be something you're not used to. But it's not necessarily good to just stop there. All right. Why is this a good intuition to have? There's something else called ethnocentrism, which is the idea that our culture is superior than all others. That is definitely not true. All right. So ethnocentrism is not the same as being an objectivist. I can look at different cultures and my culture. In fact, when you go and look at other cultures, you might start questioning some traditions in your culture and wonder whether those are, good or not. Like, it might even open your eyes against some things that you believed were correct in your culture. But it's definitely wrong to just look at other cultures and be like, my culture's good, or the other ones are bad. And that's not what someone who's against ethical relativism is saying. They're just saying that there's some things in a culture that might not be very good. Like, example, think of the Nazis, right? So if you're going to be a real relativist, you can think, okay, well, the genocide that the Nazis enacted was fine because they accepted it in their culture. Uh, that doesn't seem very appealing to me. And think of other things, right? So we can still think of different cultures as something interesting, and that can even lead us to challenge our own culture, our own traditions. But we don't have to give up the idea that there can be, some moral progress, and there's some things, if they harm people, and that people do not consent to, and so forth, they're not acceptable, even though different cultures will do it. And some things in our culture are not acceptable. I mean, it's not obvious, and over time, people discuss them more and more and make some progress, hopefully. Or hopefully we don't go back, we go forward. But it's still, one thing doesn't, they're not logically connected, all right? So ethical relativism and cultural relativism are different things. And Pojman tries to explain that in the reading. So you could have you can think that, yes, cultural relativism is true, ethical relativism is not true. You can think ethical relativism is true, but actually you could go and search other cultures. And even if you had, like, most cultures agreeing on something, you could still say that ethical relativism was true. So logically, those things are not connected. All right. So say if you're like, you go to, like, I don't know, like 20 countries in Europe, and they all have the same culture. They don't, but let's just imagine they all have the same moral culture. You could still say, okay, all these countries have this same moral culture, but I still think ethical relativism is true. It's not, I don't have to go, I can argue for it independently of whether I find examples of cultures believing different things or not. So they're logically different things. And ethnocentrism, which is the idea that our culture is better than all the other ones, that's just not true. So that's just not true, in my opinion. So that's not what anybody's talking about when they're talking about these things. All right. So that's, I guess, what I wanted to say about this reading. Hopefully it's kind of helps you understand the complexity of ethics and the different, like, sort of positions you can have. But it's also the idea of this reading, together with my other videos, hopefully will help you understand what implications there are on taking a relativist position, on taking an objectivist position. And then we're going to study all these different theories. So I hope you enjoy what's coming ahead now. I think next week we're going to do Aristotle and so forth, virtue ethics, and it'll be fun. All right. Let me see if I can stop sharing. Oops, I can't stop sharing. So I'll just stop it, the recording. All right, bye.